Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and all other creatures. I welcome you all to the third interdisciplinary Psychedelics conference, which is now held for the third time here in Åbo Academy. And now the theme of this year's conference is challenging psychedelics. We want to address problems, and we want to raise self-criticism about psychedelics, the topic that many of us are very enthusiastic about in many ways. On the risk of ego tripping, let me frame this talk from a personal perspective. I have been doing academic research on various topics for 20 years, like basically my whole adult life. Philosophy of mind and language and cognitive psychology and bilingualism research. And what got me interested in psychedelics research was a personal experience, but it wasn't a drug experience. I was doing philosophy on the mind-body problem, and suddenly I had this really strong insight experience. One crispy winter day, I was working at home. I suddenly just realized that consciousness is fundamental. We have gotten this whole thing like the wrong way. It's not consciousness that emerges from the brain, that is basically the opposite way round. And this was really strong experience. I didn't know what to make of it. And it was really emotional, and it basically transformed my whole materialistic worldview upside down. And so I, of course, tried to formulate this insight, which I thought basically solved the whole mind-body problem. I tried to communicate it to my fellow philosophers, academic philosophers at the philosophy department, and they just were rolling their eyes, and they were a bit like thinking that he's gone crazy. And then I tried to make an article based on that insight, and never got any feedback on that. So now, like afterwards, it seems that maybe I was one of those gurus that I'm now criticizing in my work. So I left philosophy and turned to psychology and forgot philosophy for a long time, until I read Michael Pollan's book about psychedelics. And I wasn't familiar with psychedelics at all. Of course, I knew what they were. But then I read the book, and I felt that I have found my tribe, so to speak. That these people interviewed in this book and all these reports, these people have had these similar kinds of insight experiences, and they call them mystical experiences. And I saw that they are similar kind of experiences. But they were not spontaneous, they were facilitated by these weird drugs called psychedelics. And of course I wanted to try psychedelics myself to see if they are like similar to my previous experience. And that started a long process, a big change in life. I became a psychedelic researcher and also started going to psychedelic conferences. And of course, I've been to many psychedelic, not psychedelic, but different kinds of scientific conferences during my academic career on cognitive psychology, philosophy, and all kinds of conferences. But psychedelics conferences, when I went first time, I saw that this is a bit different. Like, okay, on the positive side, people were really like warm and welcoming, and I could like be my own self, and everybody was really accepting and warm. But on the negative side, there was this hype and a bit like some quasi-religious elements in these conferences. And I witnessed some quite credible academic researchers who were like prominent in their own fields. They were basically jumping to conclusions and making these like really speculative claims with high confidence about related to psychedelics. And this was during the actual presentations, not during after party or anything. And I was a bit like, I cannot say shocked, but there's this like really high quality science, but there was also this quasi-religious kind of elements and stereotypical psychedelic imagery and music. And, you know, it was really different from the other academic conferences. Many psychedelic researchers, I witnessed anecdotally, like personally, many psychedelic researchers themselves have personal experiences of psychedelic substances. And with my colleague Aila Mustamo, she's cultural anthropologist, we wanted to examine this phenomenon quantitatively, in a more scientific fashion. So we created a survey, a questionnaire targeted at psychedelic researchers to ask them about whether they have personal psychedelic experiences and whether they identify with psychedelic communities or subcultures. And 111 people answered, and most of them had psychedelic experiences, and many of them also identified with communities, and they had these opinions stereotypically linked with psychedelic communities. Aila will talk more about that in her own presentation, but this basically confirms the anecdotal evidence and suspicions that psychedelic researchers can be maybe considered as a subculture to a certain extent. And they have like strong personal convictions in some cases, and they have personal experiences which we know, evidence-based, can be quite transforming and convincing. And you know, it's not difficult to see that this poses a risk to science if the persons have like really strong personal interests to what they study. And you can see this if you look at some writings or presentations by psychedelic researchers. So this is one thing that motivated this year's theme of the conference, challenging psychedelics. So we wanted to explicitly, in Finnish we say, lift a cat on the table, nostaa kissa pöydälle. It's related to like identifying the gender, no, the biological sex of the cat. Don't ask me more. We wanted to lift the cat on the table and to like explicitly discuss all these challenges related to psychedelics, which includes these personal experiences and convictions in opposition to science, which is supposed to be neutral or balanced, maybe not purely objective ever, maybe it's not possible, but at least encourage like self-criticism and self-reflection as researchers, and to address all kinds of methodological challenges that we are facing in this field, related to, for example, methodology in clinical trials, related to blinding and placebo effects, or the selection of volunteers in the research trials who might have experiences of psychedelics previously. And also about ethical problems related to when we give these substances to people in clinical trials, can they give informed consent, because they cannot really expect what will happen, because psychedelics can produce these even radical changes in worldview and values, which can also affect like human relations, and it can set you apart from other people, from your family, for example. If you have had this big revelation, really meaningful experience, and you try to communicate it to your friends or family, and they just don't understand what you are talking about, it can create like a cliff, like a gap between you, which is maybe one of the reasons why psychedelic researchers and psychedelic using people frequently seek the company of each other, because they speak the same language to a certain extent. And also problems related to utilization of indigenous knowledge or know-how in indigenous cultures. The way that we Westerners somehow like pick certain points from indigenous cultures, sometimes to defend or motivate our use of psychedelics, or to legitimize or to validate our use, because you know these have been sacramental mushrooms in ancient cultures, so we also want to get trippy. Well, all kinds of these things, which we will hear in due course. from Christine. So, yes, that is the theme of this year, challenging psychedelics. I warmly welcome you all, and I wish you a really fruitful and good conference experience, and I hope that we can acknowledge these challenges and overcome them to make psychedelic science even more valid and good and true. Thank you.
Welcome. It's my great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. So I've chosen this slightly bombastic title, and then when writing the talk I found it's much harder to do than I thought. Thank you, Jussi, for your introduction, by the way. I feel very sympathetic to this. I could have a similar story to tell some other time, maybe not now. I stick to my slides for the time being. So, decolonizing praxis in Western psychedelia. Looking at what could a psychedelic ethics mean, coming to it from having worked for 20 years on other biomedical innovations, especially genetics and stem cell research, I found that there is a much more fascinating dimension to it that with these two topics didn't come to the fore as much, tying me much closer to my philosophical origins in Frankfurt critical theory. So this decolonizing topic is really important to me, and it's sort of, when you look at the psychedelic discourse from a ethics perspective, it strikes you very quickly that there is a underdeveloped classical medical ethics, although of course there is medical ethics around which one can fairly well use. But there are other interesting problems arising, and I felt that it might make sense to use this metaphor of the binoculars to look at what we talk about, or what I want to talk about, talking about decolonization. And I introduced at the beginning, and I won't come back to it much, this term of counter-colonization, which was recently introduced by Ailton Krenak, a Brazilian philosopher and indigenous philosopher, which I find exciting because it very clearly carries the idea that decolonizing or counter-colonizing is something we need to do now. It's not unraveling and ordering things that have gone wrong in the past. There is something much more presentist to it, something that is relevant for us now. So if we look, on the one hand, as a philosopher, I'd say every human practice has an inherent ethic. Even so-called neutrality or objective viewpoints from the sciences, there is no such way as being objective. So there is a way in which framing a point of view or a praxis as neutral or as objective can be criticized and has been criticized for the disengagement, for the way in which we actually don't care. I can get back to that later. But using a microscope in ethics always means looking at the very concrete, looking at the specific, looking at an individual situation where somebody tries to figure out what should I do now. And that is a totally important ethical question. But there are, in bioethics especially, opened up wider lenses, using not a microscope but binoculars, to actually be able to sort of take slightly more distant or closer perspectives on a wider field of questions and having a three-dimensional image. So there is a way in which we could look through this metaphor with the binoculars at a question that is more like, how can injustice or violence be overcome under given conditions, taking context into account, not pretending to be objective, not trying to be ruthlessly generalist, one rule for all and forever kind of thing, but actually trying to develop an ethics that brings in different power relations, different interests, and the ways in which dynamics unfold in the psychedelic field and in many others. So this telescopic lens that many of my colleagues take, that aligns in ethics take and have taken in modern philosophical ethics, a generalist view where we have the principle that counts under all circumstances, that aligns so very well with the scientific neutrality and objectivity, where it doesn't really matter what your individual situation is or the wider cultural context and its history, is the one we don't want here. I would clearly argue against. That is the ethic that is careless and is closely aligned with coloniality, because it has always a triumphalist position in which all other viewpoints are less relevant. One of the texts on decolonization, and I won't go through all these points here because there are obviously too many, but I didn't want to pretend there were only 2 or 3. So Nelson Maldonado Torres wrote this longer paper on the outline of 10 theses on coloniality and decoloniality, in which he discusses many texts by Frantz Fanon. So he makes these 10 points and then adds Fanon quotations to it, and then tries to unpack what he means with coloniality, how we can understand that, and how we can understand decoloniality. And as you see, I've only highlighted the last 4 of these here. He says decoloniality involves a decolonial epistemic turn whereby the damné emerges as a questioner, thinker, theorist, writer, and communicator. Then his 8th, and as I say, in the text that you can find on the Frantz Fanon website, you can read up on it if you're interested. Then 8, decoloniality involves an aesthetic, erotic and spiritual decolonial turn whereby the damné emerge as creator. 9, decoloniality involves an activist turn whereby the damné emerge as an agent of social change. And finally, decoloniality is a collective project. And that is, yes?
Could I ask what specifically is meant here by damné? Is it generally the subjects that are supposed to be oppressed or victims of coloniality?
Yes, I mean it's a French word that Frantz Fanon uses for those that are cast out. Yeah. Maybe that's the clearest translation. So these ideas of an epistemic turn, an aesthetic, erotic, and spiritual turn, and where those that are usually sidelined or outcast or diminished or seen as non-valid become questioners and theorists, become agents and creators, and the importance of the community in this, I think, are important to keep in mind. And this is where I think are very good starting points for thinking what this could mean for a psychedelic praxis. Now I give you a few more quotes. It seems my day of quotes. But yes, in this I find in many ways very interesting book that Biela Baci and Clancy Kavanagh published a few years back. There is a whole section on decolonial texts from indigenous and decolonial authors. One of these texts, this quote, the title of the article is Colonial Shadows in the Psychedelic Renaissance, and Diana Negrin writes in it, the reality, both for indigenous observers and many dedicated to environmental and human rights advocacy, is that the global consumption of these plants reflects relations of power rooted in the racial order created with colonialism and the ongoing destruction of the very habitats these plants are endemic to. In other words, seemingly benign practices aimed at therapy or recreation are endangering the very plants they are celebrating. So this is one key aspect. What does it mean when the West goes crazy about consuming psychedelics that are natural plants grown in very specific locations in this world and that are guarded and stewarded by indigenous people? Open question for now. A second text is by Leopardo Yavabane. The title is My Degrees from the Forest, and one could have selected a longer quote. I chose just this bit. While the global spread of ayahuasca and indigenous culture is something that I support and has given me great joy and opportunity, there are some things that worry me. My main concern is that our people and our culture will be forgotten as the white man gets carried away with being an authority on ayahuasca. And finally, Umiak, a group of ayahuasqueros in Colombia, indigenous ayahuasqueros, has written the following, and this is my title to it, and it is also the title of their actual article, Cultural Appropriation and Monetization of Ancestral Knowledge. And they have the statement in it. It's in a block in the text. Umiak does not recognize the legitimacy of persons foreign to the communities, neo-shamans and charlatans, or indigenous drinkers with limited experience as practitioners of the medicine. A preoccupation for Umiak is the proliferation of neo-shamanic practices, the commercialization of the sacred plants, and the processes of cultural appropriation and of extraction of local knowledge. This includes academic research when it is not clearly aimed at strengthening the indigenous organization's autonomy and self-governance. So these are three voices that make very clear concerns from indigenous viewpoints, and that is certainly a most important starting point for thinking about a decolonial practice. Listening to those who come from the other side and tell us what their concerns are. Now, decolonial studies has a long history, philosophically speaking, not very long, maybe 50 years or 70 years, 80 years, if you so want. We think in millennia, but I don't. So for me, 70 years is a lot, starting with Frantz Fanon, or can the subaltern speak? Subaltern being another word for the damnee here. On decolonizing methodologies, texts written often by people from former colonial countries, but also linked closely and at the same time emerging in Western academic discourse as the second wave feminism. So there is an intersection between the feminist critique of the time and the decolonial theory that develops, which is maybe not just accidental. Anyway, they pick out similar tropes, and I'm daring to go to one of my favorite feminists on this, Val Plumwood, who did this interesting little thing in her book, Feminism and the Mastery of Nature, where she has a chapter on colonialism in which she distinguishes these ways in which dualistic practices are oppressive. And she criticizes dualisms as the main epistemic culprit for the structures that exclude, whether that is in a binary of genders or sexes, or whether that is in white versus other, and other is this sort of huge pool of everything that is somehow not white. She identifies this othering as naturalization and essentialization. It relates to race, gender, and color. It's attached with impurity, with uncleanness, with sort of emotional stuff. All the sort of murky things, the primitive, the private, that which is not open. Yeah? And we see these Enlightenment metaphors coming in on what is to you the left side of this column. Culture, reason, male, mind, master, reason, rationality, mind, spirit, freedom, universal, civilized, production, public, subject, self. On the other side, these other terms. I think that's quite a powerful graphic, and one could extend it. As you may know, I've written a paper with a large group of colleagues. We met during the pandemic in online meetings, and then we wrote this article together to discuss. So we met to discuss decolonial theory, and then this article came from it. And one of the key ideas when thinking about psychedelics and decolonization is that, yes, if you have... So we draw here on an article that is one of the most cited papers in decolonial literature, which claims that decolonization is not a metaphor. And if you do that, if you make that claim, you implicitly are back in the binary, because then you have the literal, which is on the side of the rational and the reason and the clean. And you have the metaphorical, which is on the side of the murky and muddy. And so we claim that actually maybe it is a metaphor and maybe it has to be a metaphor. And that if we only take the North American perspective on settler colonialism, which is quite a specific constellation of the colonial history of the last 400 years, with European countries colonizing most other parts of the world, then that is actually quite a limited perspective. And that coloniality here is not just something we can correct because it happened in the past. In psychedelics, it is something that actually happens now. So how do we prevent adding insult to injury or injury to injury better? So the task would be to analyze intersecting colonizing practices. That we need a critical analysis in psychedelic humanities, which I still think, and we need disruptive interventions. And it is not necessarily clear what those could be. I've spent my entire time preparing this talk thinking about it. One aim of decolonial ethics is to avoid unknowingly reifying insidious colonial logics in efforts to overcome that very power in the study of psychedelic practices, such as in places like Mexico or the Amazon. A decolonial ethics would be capable of creating new forms of relationality grounded in a different social ontology. Big words. Very hard to do in praxis. So what becomes clear here is what I'm arguing for is we need to recognize and value differences. It is not a binary, and maybe the sort of murky mess is the stuff we need to encounter, to analyze and to disentangle. Not because we can then put it into clear boxes, but we need to study the insidious intersections of power structures that actually make it so easy for my colleagues in psychedelic research, for instance, to say, well, but in the end we have so little funding in this field. Does it really matter what the ethics of the person is who gives you the research funding? Shouldn't we be glad to get anything at all? So what does respectful, which is a key term in these indigenous quotes I've read you earlier, respectful. What does that mean, being respectful? It means learning about histories of oppression and violence, how they shape the animals, plants, and the plant medicine experts. Attention to differences between uses and traditions. It is not, this one psychedelic community. Who creates that community? Is this white people in the West doing research in laboratories, talking to the others every now and then deciding that we are now a community? Who decides when a community is a community? Linda Martin Alcoff, in her book, The Future of Whiteness, proposes, drawing on Hegel, this concept of double consciousness, this way in which me being here, speaking on this topic, being a white, female, Western, German philosopher in a not quite marginal university in Great Britain, my position of power in this is problematic. And for many people, me talking about this topic, I have to be aware that is seen as such. Yeah? So, on the other hand, that cannot mean that people such as me cannot do that work, because it is community work and you need the allies, just like feminism needs male allies. So does decoloniality need as many allies as it can get? On that basis, I take the right, and thank you to talking about this topic. So balancing one's own knowledge, these certainties we have, and actually staying open for the certainties and knowledges of others, which can actually come from quite an odd angle. And that's okay. And then this question of how can we actually produce critical analysis that's not just theoretical top-down, but actually grounded in experience, and not only in my experience, but in the experience of those many very different people who have an experience to contribute to this field. I said earlier we need to look at the history, and so I do a tiny bit of history here. As you will be aware, psychedelic use is at least documented very well, and there's lots of debate about that, but at least it's undoubtedly very well documented from the 1500s onwards, because we know this from the documents that people have been studying in the archives of the Americas and the histories of colonization, and what actually has been reported by the colonizers about those weird things that those local people do. In the 1800s onwards, we find private uses by some eccentric philosophers and thinkers who write about their psychonautic experience trying this, that, or the other. Very experimental, like Thomas de Quincey or Huxley or others, who sort of think about trying this stuff and then, as in Huxley's case, writing quite a lot about not very much experience. In the 1900s, we have this interesting phenomena of psychedelic religions. They are all founded in Brazil. They are all founded by actually black people. That is an immigrant group into Brazil from Africa that is part of the colonial history of Brazil. Yeah? Now they are expanded massively into especially North America, but the Santo Daime is, I think, everywhere. I don't know whether Santo Daime is in Finland. It's definitely in England and Wales. So the prohibition of psychedelics has actually given massive boost to this sort of religious practices that are an interesting concoction of indigenous practices, African practices, and Christian religion. Luis Eduardo and Luna and many others have been writing about this. It's quite fascinating what happens in these religions and where they come from, how they have developed. Then we have the lab creations. We have synthetic psychedelics. We have drugs created in laboratories that seem to engender similar experiences. Now we come into the hippie phase, and then the music festivals, the club and rave scenes, etc., alongside what then in the prohibition in Nixon's war on drugs, which makes, again, this drug use into an underground movement and gives the religions a quite peculiar position. It also leads to narco-capitalism, huge markets of drugs that actually shape the political face and practices in the countries, especially in the Middle East and in Southern America. So this is not just a little thing. The impact of this on the way people live, on the way people disappear, on the collaborations between politics and government with criminal drug gangs, etc., is striking. And yet, most of the poppy seed grown in the world is still used for opium in pharmaceutical companies in Switzerland and the United States. Then we have new drugs following the prohibition, such as ketamine, developed for something else, or MDMA. I guess you know that. But this sort of making sense of this long history that is so closely interwoven with coloniality, because the knowledge in the West from indigenous use originally comes from observing it, and then in the last 100 years from anthropologists going and studying it, often writing quite covertly. One of my friend Osiris González Romero has done recent work going in the archives in Mexico and look at the detailed texts from the 1500s on how colonization went, how people were persecuted for using psychedelic substances, how the madness was described. How the Catholic Church and the conquistadors actually produced a regime of enormous oppression against indigenous practice and delegitimized it entirely. And that is long before the 1971 war on drugs. The violence around this is shocking. The ways in which he can document the persecution of psychedelic use in Mexico and in Brazil with punished with prison, torture, and death. I just looked this up if you're interested in. What is it that we colonize in psychedelics? As we've heard before, yes, there are the plants. There are some animals that might be affected from the monetization and Western consumer interest. There are also indigenous knowledge practices and indigenous peoples and persons when we bring in the token indigenous person on this or that companies or research trials, governing board or ethics board or something. But then I have been saying in recent years a lot that I actually think there is another colonization happening, especially in the medicalization of psychedelics, but maybe also with the triumph that the religions, the psychedelic religions, are so much celebrating now their growth over the minds and experiences of people. It matters so much what somebody is led to expect. And the context to a psychedelic experience is so important. And then there is the hopes and needs of people who read all the time now in the last 10, 15 years how much healing can be obtained, but who for some reason or other did not yet have that healing or are not admitted to the trials and seek that healing elsewhere. A huge growing tourism market, just like with reproductive tourism on surrogate pregnancies or with stem cell tourism on some lauded treatment somewhere in India, you here have a huge movement of psychedelic tourism. My colleague Evgenia Fotiu has recently written quite a bit about that, the way in which Iquitos has really transformed. And Diana Negrin in this article I mentioned earlier writes about it. So what does colonialism do? How does it work? It always works the same way. With extraction, adaptation, and laboratory reproduction of the things that were originally found somewhere else. And then the appropriation, marketization, and the control of profits. In this, you see that Western authoritative institutions collaborate. Yeah? The sciences with law and economy together create this sort of soup in which the monetization can perfectly develop. Those are each just following their own pursuits and doing their thing. But in their collaboration, science being part of this project, they can be and have been extremely effective in the last 400 years in bringing to market and owning all sorts of things. Land, plants, patents, and fully monetize on them, stealing indigenous practices from here, there, and elsewhere. Which is very well documented in the history of medicine. So, the medicalization of psychedelics, a topic I've been talking about in recent years a lot, looking at this, and I keep this short here, has these practices that I think have something to do with epistemic domination on the one hand and mind control on the other. So epistemic domination means that when any practice of psychedelic use is filtered through the well-evidenced channels of science and finally being recognized and accredited and lauded and somebody gets a Nobel Prize or something, then all other ways of using it are somewhat implicitly delegitimized. You don't need to do much for that. It's just that the one way we know it works is that. So psychedelics are filtered through procedures, rigid experiences are produced because you need to have a stable thing to collect the data that you need to create the evidence for your approval process. So the trips are guided. And one can wonder to which degree there is epistemic violence. I do think that the ways in which we expect heroes' journeys, the way in which music is selected often, that is very culturally, has the imprimatur of Western classical music, which is probably not only because you don't need to pay for the rights to use it. I think there is much more to it than that. So there is an implicit context in which we might see some epistemic violence that is actually where people who seek help, who need help, who have a diagnosis, who are accepted into a trial, are then being given a whole metaphysical framework in which to read that experience and the music that goes with it. And this Hopkins playlist, so much requiems. And then, of course, there is that you need a diagnosis. You actually need to make yourself a patient first. That is a position of weakness. You are not an equal. You are the person who is in need and is given something as in need. Yeah? That might explain to a degree why there is so much patient compliance, that you find that people coming out of trials first tell you how fantastic and great it was. And then we find Tessino Rani writing about how they seek more help in online forums and going to the Amazon and this or that, because actually they didn't get enough, but they didn't say this to this nice young woman who was so pretty and friendly and who gave them this questionnaire, and they were so glad they were accepted in it in the first place. So this is how some of these power structures in a medicalization context work, not only with psychedelics, that is a very widespread and well-documented phenomenon, but it applies here too. And I find it is under-discussed. There is not enough transparency about these issues. Then there is the hype, as I said earlier, that develops tourism markets, and there is this way in which we have this delegitimization of indigenous knowledges, where we've had some indigenous ayasqueros and other healers, shamans, saying in recent years that they don't actually know what those white people want. They come and they seem to want something, but what on earth do they want? They don't understand what their problems are. Which is not a surprise, because the peculiar ways we live do not necessarily ideally match and represent a familiar experience to somebody outside our cultural contexts. And then, of course, this point I've made before, that there is something quite quixotic in this whole exercise, inducing madness to cure madness, since the psychedelics were aligned with madness from the conquistadors and the first descriptions 500 years ago. We now find that it is madness that cures madness, which itself, psychological theory speak, is sort of an interesting conundrum. That I don't think we have a solution for. All these nice images of brains don't actually provide an explanation why this would work. There's no theoretical reflection on how or why this would work. So we try to square circles. On the one hand, the people, my esteemed colleagues and friends who work in clinical trials with psychedelics, try to, in a way, revolutionize psychiatric clinic, and that is urgently needed. With the very best intentions, there is something that might actually create a breakthrough, that might get this field that is so stuck, where we have huge numbers of diagnoses and so many people on which the antidepressants fail, who we can't get off their addictions, etc. So there is a way in which, and there is a clear intent to help those who suffer or violated and alienated majorities, to revive interconnections with spiritual, ecodelic communal life. Everyone working in that field I've met would recognize this. This is what we want. This is what these substances and experiences can do. So by pushing this route, we try to find those most in need and help them. On the other hand, we obey and follow the procedures of the institutions, the good old scientific protocols, the need for a certain way of presenting one's clinical trial data, collecting data in the first place, designing a trial in order to be able to collect the data, to then get approval. There is a whole chain of things that come with it that actually are designed almost to counteract what is in point one here, because they individualize, they separate people. The way we have to do this, push a psychedelic, exceptional, extraordinary experience somebody we hope would have, into something where we can give them a questionnaire where they say on the level of a scale of 1 to 10, how high was X, Y, or Z? Yeah? Is this really adequate? I don't think so. Not that I have a solution of how to do it much better. As long as you follow the clinical trial route, you're somehow in a bind. And then, of course, there's the other thing. Research needs money, and you get money when you can produce intellectual property. So there is a way in which science is done for patents. And some people defend patents as, if I patent it, I can make sure that nobody is misusing it. It also means you make sure that nobody is using it other than paying you for the privilege. And that has something to do with what I said earlier about delegitimizing other practice. So decolonizing then would entail a critical reflection on and some material change. One is returning the land. After this paper we wrote on decolonizing practice, I was giving one of my students, who is Mayan from Guatemala, a little talk about how difficult it is to return the land and this and that. And I was having all these little, but what would happen? And the land is exploited, and so it's not really fertile anymore. And then he just said, just give it back. And I found myself caught in this typical arrogance of white people, thinking I have to find a solution of what indigenous people would best do with their land if they had it. Whoa. I tell you this because this happens so easily. That one overthinks things as if it was my responsibility to think this through. Why can't I just let it go and give it to those who it might rightly belong to? And let them decide what happens to it, whether anything happens to it, whatever. So decolonizing has something to do with letting go and giving up control, giving up the sense that we would know, at least that I would know. And then it has something to do with freeing the mind. In these psychedelic experiences, it is all about the liberation, the other ways of seeing, the way in which we decenter, in which we create connection, feel connected, etc. On the other hand, we do this in a format which is really restrictive. So this needs to be thought about. I don't have the solution to this, but it is something that I find the field needs to discuss much more in detail. But the psychedelics is not just medicalization. That's one thing that happens. And it is an important thing to study, because the science is part of the colonial project, always was. But the other psychedelic experiences and practices matter as well. So there is this photo of Maria Sabina, of some images from the internet. So religion, rave, retreat space, and Maria Sabina as the image of the indigenous. I apologize to Maria Sabina. But I wanted to bring these up as in, when we talk about decolonization, all these communities matter as well. Because who are the experts on this? I started with these quotes from indigenous peoples from Southern America. But actually, there is more to it than that. We've had 50 years or 60 of underground work, of people who actually have, be it through raves, be it through religions, be it through therapeutic spaces or well-being spaces of one way or another, been doing a lot of work on actually keeping the spirit, and developed huge expertise in how to use and not to use substances. Why are the experts always the scientists? What makes an expert? When our indigenous colleagues tell us that they are experts, indeed we say, oh yes, of course we know. And we do. But the same might apply for people who have a lot of experience in these other contexts. And so the basis for solidarity and collaborative work is actually much wider than just one between a few Western academics and scientists and indigenous peoples from the Southern Americas. There's a whole world of people who have experience, and their experience is not seen. So some more diagnostic observations and research questions on this. So, yes, we have the doctrine of discovery that turns everything into a resource, and that relates to ownership. The ownership structures of capitalism that is closely entrenched with the colonial project are key. We should never forget to think about property structures in this. And property turns often that which is owned into a good that the owner can do with as they please. This whole concept of ownership in the psychedelic space becomes really problematic, in many others too, but in this one it is particularly striking. So I want to point this out. Then we have actual projects of bioprospecting that have to do with commodifying and creating intellectual property regimes on new substances, old substance, where does what grow, how can we use it, how can we distill it, how can we recreate it, synthesize it, etc. There is a way in which we create, currently we can watch the creation of a bioeconomic space in the psychedelic arena, and that needs to be watched and studied. And then I said this about expertise in the party and rave cultures, but to which degree are they also part of a culture industry? So is every rave a revolution? I don't think so. So there is at least a question of where this sits within a culture industry in which you go to the rave, and if you drank too much and you have a bad come down, you might not be quite up to it on a Monday, but we all expect you to be okay on a Tuesday. Ecologists celebrate indigenous expertise in land cultivation for diversity, and this is the point I made earlier about giving land back. So we celebrate the expertise. On the one hand, we know that nowhere on this planet is more biodiversity than where indigenous people live with their land they live in. Because the practices of exchange, of return, of harvest are practices that are environmentally the most diversity creating, we know. Creating, not maintaining, making diversity. This is important. And we praise psychedelic experiences for their ecodelic potential. But can those experiences that people have on psychedelics really make them care more and act for the environment? Has psychedelic experiences something to do with just transforming myself and being happier, which is absolutely important? Yeah? I'm not saying there's no point to feeling better and not being depressed. There totally is. But maybe when we take the criticism that always lay in indigenous uses of psychedelics, even underground, against the colonizers and unbeknownst to them, in this bubble from which people like Maria Sabina unfortunately liberated or gave away. But this way in which many indigenous peoples don't want to share their practices and keep them to themselves is fairly legitimate under the historical conditions of colonization and the history of experience they have. But on the other hand, when we have ecodelic experiences or when we have interconnectedness experiences, are they just for me? Or is there something where actually something political should come with this? Is there not more to take from this? We have, to my knowledge, no organization in the psychedelic groups I've been engaged with that really has a strong pull for asking for the political changes that all of what I've been saying so far implies. And are Western spiritualities, pagan or animist practices free from colonizing? What happens when we actually develop these new rituals of spirituality? What power structures happen in psychedelic communal spaces? It is true that we need to be more transparent and open, and as long as psychedelics are criminalized, there is no way, especially women, can be safe in this space, because there is exploitation and there is no way to report. That needs to stop. I mean, I'm absolutely in favor of decriminalize now. But then what? That is not all that is to do. That's just the first absolutely necessary step to then think how to manage and ensure safety, respect on every level of engagements in the psychedelic space. So the articles I showed you before, I think I have sort of worked through some of the claims they have been making on cultural appropriation, on authority and epistemicide, on overconsumption, and the ways in which life forms can be put at risk. There is another paper that was published in Lancet Regional Health that gives us 8 R's, 8 ethical principles by indigenous scholars published on how we should use the ethical principles, that's the title, the ethical principles of traditional indigenous medicine to guide Western psychedelic research and practice. And those are the ethical principles: reverence, respect, responsibility, relevance, regulation, reparation, restoration, and reconciliation. This is the problem with principles, is always that they are too abstract. I mean, this is always, how do you fill that out? I've been spending quite a few months, maybe years now, thinking about how to fill that out. And it is definitely a community project to fill that out. And there are some indigenous groups of researchers now actually working together in Brazil, for instance, in Mexico, on actually filling this out. It doesn't need to be filled out by me. But I have some suggestions for action that apply to Western researchers. What could people like me try to keep in mind when we engage with this space? One is we need to engage in an ethical discourse that is non-hierarchical and that actually really gives place to listen. Then we need to educate people. For instance, I've been talking to several of my clinician colleagues and said, do you tell people about the history of the substance you're giving them when you're using psilocybin? Do they know where this comes from? No, I could do that. Yeah, you could do that. Maybe you should do that. That would be a start. And then this question of own space unadulterated by profit motives. And that, of course, in the clinic becomes almost impossible. The profit motive is written through any attempt at actually mainstreaming psychedelics on the clinical route. Yeah? And that is a big conundrum that it would be great if one could overcome it. And then the question is, should we maybe focus on laboratory-produced products? Why don't we use much more LSD? Why celebrate so much indigenous experience when we have in the West rich experience of people who use LSD, who use MDMA and ketamine, the stuff that we make in laboratories? Why do we have to actually use the indigenous natural substances? I do see the glow. Yeah, there is the glow. But maybe we should rethink that. Maybe our way to use psychedelics is not necessarily adopt practices that belong to a very radically different culture and way of living with and in nature. So, as a question, maybe one should actually focus our research on lab-produced drugs, because it would protect the environment. It would avoid this massive rush for actually growing peyote and the ingredients of ayahuasca on a massive scale somewhere, roading the Amazon, not for soya now, but actually for Banisteriopsis carpi. Then we need to monitor the flows of IP and profits in a fight for fair distribution. That is more easily said than done. But actually, I think it matters where the money comes from and who is giving it to you. And it at least is important to look at who gets what in this anyway. What is the revenue chain in a lot of this research that is currently undertaken? There are some colleagues who actually study these effects of the psychedelic boom with indigenous plants and animals, such as Larry Norris, who has been doing a lot of the work on examining exactly how the use of peyote through the indigenous church in America, which one is it? Lost me. What actually happens with peyote growth and the right to grow it, etc. Or Osiris has looked at this as well as many others. Then recognize and care really about how others feel and how they analyze the developments. We need to talk about these developments, as I've just tried to start us doing. Then there is the other option of not taking part. My colleague Rua Benjamin wrote this book on the ethics of refusal. The ethics of refusing to do things that are carried at you, the uses, or where science is being used or science is being conducted, where it's actually, we have to be able to say no sometimes. One has to say no. And yes, then the question of solidarity, collaboration, and community indifference. The practices to develop this, it seems we need to get better at finding ways of actual collaboration in which other groups of experts can have the leading voice. So this is now my last slide. Decolonizing the emerging research landscape means nurture and attend to the voices of different, diverse, marginalized experts. More critical social science and humanities research of these power relations that are in action, some of which I've tried to describe. Disrupt hype of progress that feeds media industry and profit interests. Value-driven research, problematizing past and new colonization, and then wide engagement for good answers to individual and societal problems. Because why we do this, the reason that psychedelics have become such a seeming solution to a problem, we need to look at what is the problem. The problem is incredible unhappiness and mental ill health. And that doesn't necessarily... Half of my students probably have anxiety or depression diagnoses. If we have so many people in a young generation feeling mentally not up to the world that they have to face, then we need to ask why. We cannot stop at just finding solutions to help each individual out of their hole. Where to? The where to needs to be answered. So I really think we need to look at the wider questions within which this psychedelic clinical research is just a tiny little drop. And if we don't look at the greater picture, if we don't use our binoculars to look at the bigger picture of what is the actual problem for which we are here seeking a solution, and can we maybe find other ways of alleviating that problem? And I think activism is the actual only answer to this. Then psychedelics will just be one more biomedical technology that may or may not succeed for you and your friends. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Christine, for a thought-provoking talk. Now we have time for some questions or comments.
Thank you very much for this talk. So many things I feel like commenting on, but maybe I'll catch up on your suggestion of using lab-produced drugs, right? If we were to do that, only focus on LSD, do we have any concerns of colonialism, or is there any need to decolonize? Can we completely forgo this idea if we just stay away from psilocybin and ayahuasca and stick to LSD? Because I agree with that idea that since we have options that are probably less problematic than for these sort of medical and other contexts, maybe we should do that. But does that completely eliminate this problem? Does something remain?
I mean, the question is, of course, who does the LSD belong to? I think it might have run out of IP protection, though, because it's too old. So there's some good news. But interestingly, hardly any research of the clinical trials is being conducted with LSD. And there is some sort of, in this whole field, there is this huge avoidance of anything that has the slightest tinge of smell of hippie. I mean, I'm born in the 60s. I'm actually sort of quite a hippie. But even though I may not look it. But there is a way in which the avoidance of that flavor is, I think, one of the greatest hindrances to using LSD. And that is just not a good argument. I don't see why that would count. I also think MDMA does a different job, but it can be obviously a very useful experience to people. So maybe there is at least something to be said for trying those first, and instead of making huge protocol lists of trying to filter through the same clinical trial all sorts of different substances, and then taking neuro images to then see how they affect your brain differently, there is so much of that currently, which is just really curiosity-driven science that isn't getting anywhere towards a goal and seems quite undirected, really. Just, that could be interesting. Yeah, it could be interesting, but probably it isn't, because what counts is the experience and not what your brain image says anyway, in my view. So I think, yes, there's something to be said for working with LSD for now, and maybe the mushrooms we grow at home. Well, lots of. It's a good time now.
Thank you so much. You mentioned one very interesting publication of Yuria Selidvan about ethical principles to guide Western psychedelic research. I was wondering, have you saw any elaborations, like in practice? Have there been any fruitful dialogue between the indigenous representatives and, the global North researchers applying these ethical principles in the actual work?
I'm aware that in Brazil there is a group of indigenous researchers at the Tacoriense Institute or something like this, who work out ethical principles, and there is the International Ayahuasca Conference next year in Italy, which is normally held in the Amazon, to discuss ethical principles from the point of view of indigenous peoples and spell that out. But of course, indigenous is one large word. Indigenous people of Finland, Norway, and Sweden are the Sami. So indigenous people exist in many countries in different ways. And so we need to be, they don't feel they are all the same. That is important to recognize. So the ways in which, and my colleague Simon Ruffle is working, has this Onaya project, doing research with indigenous peoples in Peru. So there are some attempts, and of course there is Chacruna that has always brought this to the forefront. I think it is paying due respect to Pia Labachi's work on this, as having been following this, even though there may be some criticism, but actually this is a powerful voice in that field that actually gets stuff out there and published and done. So it is important to recognize that there are attempts, and it is interesting is how can you create more of this? But then we also need to ask, what is the purpose of the psychedelic renaissance in the West? Is it really to become more indigenous? Is that even a point? I mean, is there a point to thinking this way? When I read indigenous texts, like The Falling Sky, for instance, by Davi Kopenawa, the epistemology and ontology he describes there is so difficult to follow. It is like reading magical realism. You can't just become something other than you are. The situatedness of actually realizing the familiarity and the insights we have from living where we do is really matters. And to just think we can easily immerse ourselves in other worldviews is just naive, and actually quite violent as well, because it doesn't really take the embeddedness into culture serious enough. So I think there is a way in which we need to wait who wants to collaborate with us. Invitation is one thing, but invitations have to come, for instance, with money. It's quite shocking to find how we still have to struggle to get just fully funded invitations for a family or a group of indigenous peoples to come to a conference in Europe. Yeah? Like we had with the last ICPR.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, thank you for the great keynote. You mentioned in the beginning kind of like microscope, binoculars, and telescope. I don't know if they're like metaphors, but is it kind of like micro, meso, macro levels of analyzing things? And can you kind of use the substances themselves as binoculars or telescopes, like looking at where they are, what are they doing, and what's going around the substances, and then taking different kinds of perspectives instead of this kind of just focusing on what humans are doing to the substances, but also kind of the other way around?
Are you suggesting that different substances have a different kind of focus?
Yeah.
Well, that would need proper research. if one could scroll the Arrowhead reports on whether there's any evidence for micro, macro, or meso-level vision. I mean, I've somewhat ironically used this enlightenment metaphor of the gaze, but I used it to describe different perspectives in ethics, and I do think that for everything it matters to be aware of the kind of lens you apply, and that there are different ones. I like to operate on my binocular lens, whereas someone who works in counseling clearly works with a micro perspective, because that's about one person's life and experience, and that is fine. Yeah? I have doubts about the generalizing telescopic experience. Like generally, I'm not so sure why we would be so interested in space, always seeking another Earth. Once we've destroyed this one, maybe we should engage with this one. I'm perfectly comfortable staying where I am and looking at what I can actually see with the means that to me are available, and give a three-dimensional image. And it is that aspect that I quite like about the binoculars.
So, thank you so much.